Storybox Audio.
Alan Crotzer was just 20 years old when he was sentenced to 130 years in prison for sexual battery, kidnapping, burglary, aggravated assault, robbery, and attempted robbery. July 8, 1981, 3 men broke into a Tampa, Florida home, one of which was armed with a gun. There were 5 victims inside the home, but the 38-year-old woman and 12-year-old girl were kidnapped and forced into the trunk of the assailant's vehicle. The women were driven into the woods, where the 38-year-old was raped orally and vaginally by 2 of the men, and the 12-year-old was raped by 1. The 3rd man supposedly never exited the vehicle. The 2 victims were then tied to trees and the assailants left. The robbery victims were left at home, tied up as well, but managed to record the license plate of the vehicle the assailants were driving, and proceeded to call the police. An investigation was opened, and the police tracked down the owner of the vehicle from the scene. When the police ran the license plate, they discovered it was registered to a St. Petersburg resident. The next step was to assemble a photo lineup, which included the car's owner, but neither of the victims were able to make a definitive identification. The next day, July 9th, another photo lineup was made, which now included the car's owner, Alan Crotzer, and Douglas James. It turns out that Douglas James had borrowed this vehicle from a friend who couldn't have possibly been at the scene of the crime, as they had been arrested and imprisoned at the time of the crime. In the second photo lineup, the photos were shown to the victims, and the adult rape victim and one of the robbery victims identified Douglas James as one of the assailants. When a third photo lineup was made, this time including Corlenzo James, Douglas's brother, 3 of the victims, including both rape victims, identified Corlenzo James as the 3rd assailant. The victims identified Crotzer as the man who carried the gun during the robbery and the one who raped both of the victims. Corlenzo James pled guilty to robbery and burglary charges, whereas Douglas and Crotzer were tried together. During the trial, all 5 victims made an in-court identification that Crotzer was the main assailant who held the gun and raped both victims. He was found guilty of all charges against him and was sentenced to 130 years in prison. Important factors to consider in Crotzer's conviction is that Alan testified that he was with a friend, his girlfriend, and multiple members of her family the night of the crime. However, despite Crotzer having multiple alibis for the night of the robbery, kidnapping, and rape, he was charged as the main assailant. This is most likely due to the 5 eyewitness testimonies from the victims. Eyewitness misidentification is the leading cause of wrongful convictions, and Crotzer's case had 5 of them. The issue with eyewitness identification is that our memory is unreliable, especially after a traumatic experience. It is also shown that police interrogations can push people to create false memories. Another factor is distracted thinking, which describes when witnesses are in an obvious state of stress, anxiety, mental, or physical pain, which can affect their ability to recall a situation accurately. Misdirected focus is when witnesses tend to focus on the weapon being used during the crime, so for this case, the gun, rather than the perpetrator, their face, or their body type. Many suggestive procedures were used by the police. For example, the use of a show-up instead of a lineup. The difference is that a lineup must take place at the police station, and the victim is shown many people rather than just one. A show-up can take place anywhere, at the station, in the field, or even at the crime scene itself. A show-up only includes one person at a time, rather than a group of people. This was done because one of the victims could not identify the suspect in question, Crotzer, in the photo lineup and was therefore given a single photo and was still unable to identify the person in the photo as one of the assailants. Another victim could only point out the suspect, Crotzer, after being told which photo two of the other victims have chosen. On top of all of these factors, the victims were not told that the suspect may not be in the photo lineup at all. It is possible that the police insisted that Crotzer was one of the assailants due to the fact that he was an African American, as well as having a juvenile and adult criminal record. This pertains bias that could and unfortunately may have been a factor in his conviction. Bias within the police system is one of the main factors that cause wrongful convictions, whether it be due to age, race, prior criminal records, and gender. It is fair to say that if the suspect in question was a white woman or male of high socioeconomic status, they would not have been questioned or placed within the photo lineup, especially if they have multiple alibis for the time of the crime. The forensic evidence was also skewed when being presented to the jury, as the serology analysis was flawed. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, or the FDLE, was responsible for analyzing the rape tests. Both victims took rape tests after the crime, which showed semen on the adult rape victim's vaginal swabs, underwear, and clothing. During the trial, the lab analyst stated in court that the blood markers of semen from the crime scene matched both Crotzer and the victim. However, this test is unreliable, and the lab analyst failed to mention when semen and vaginal secretions are mixed, and there is no blood group substance or enzymes that don't belong to the victim. No one can be ruled out as a perpetrator, because the victim's blood group markers could be masking them. This evidence was presented as though it was Crotzer that raped the victims, when 100% of the male population could have been responsible. This allowed the jury to believe that Crotzer was responsible for the rape, when in actuality, it could have been anyone from the male population. The FDLE was also responsible for analyzing 2 hair samples that were recovered from the adult victim's rape kit. The lab analysis testified that the hair could belong to either Crotzer or Corlenzo James. This was presented to the jury as fact, when in reality there is not adequate empirical data on the various characteristics in human hair. The analyst that testified in court was prejudicial, and the assertion that the hairs were similar or different to the assailants lacked probative value. Lastly, another factor that could have contributed to Crotzer's conviction was his co-defendant, Douglas James. Crotzer could deny his involvement and persistently claim to be innocent, but if James never confessed that he was not there, Crotzer's claims wouldn't be taken seriously. After spending nearly 25 years in prison, Alan Crotzer was exonerated. Specific evidence that was used to exonerate him includes the consideration of his multiple alibis. Also, that the FDLE found more sperm samples and evidence and decided to analyze them again. Because of the many years Crotzer was in prison, DNA analysis had greatly improved. The sperm samples were tested at 3 different labs, which later confirmed that Crotzer was not the rapist. Douglas James later stated that Crotzer was not an accomplice, and that it was him, his brother Corlenzo, and their friend who committed the crime. They even went as far as to say that they had never met Crotzer prior to the crime. Where is Alan Crotzer today?
Kept track of every day he spent in prison.
For 24 years, 6 months, 13 days and 4 hours.
Since being proven innocent, Crotzer has been working to keep kids on the straight and narrow. As a volunteer for the Innocence Project, he's been an outspoken critic of eyewitness identifications.
We're trying to raise awareness that the system is failing at a large rate really fast.
In 2008, Alan Crotzer was compensated $1.25 million for the 25 years he spent behind bars for a crime he did not commit. He is one of only 9 exonerees who have been compensated for their wrongful convictions in Florida.